They were found huddled together near the edge of a dry riverbed. 3 hyena pups, barely breathing, their fur matted with dust and fear. Their mother had been killed by poachers, and the rest of the clan had vanished into the bush. No one expected them to survive the night, but then something remarkable happened. At a nearby wildlife rehabilitation center, a gentle Labrador named Sunny, known for her calming presence, was introduced to the pups. What followed stunned everyone. Sunny didn't just sniff them or watch from a distance. She lay down beside them, let them press against her belly, and even began to nudge them toward her, inviting them to nurse, to belong. For weeks they slept curled up in her fur. They followed her every step like she was their real mother. And when they grew up, when they were no longer tiny orphans but young, powerful hyenas, what they did for Sunny left every rescuer in tears. This is not just a story of rescue. It's a story of choosing love over fear, of a dog who became a mother in the most unexpected way, and what happened when her adopted children had to decide who they truly were. They found the hyenas shivering under a broken fence, covered in mud and buzzing with flies. No mother in sight, no pack nearby, just 3 tiny pups with bloated bellies and clouded eyes, barely old enough to walk, let alone survive on their own. The rangers had seen many things in the wild, but nothing quite like this. Hyenas weren't meant to be alone, and certainly not this small. Their cries weren't just of hunger. They were of grief. No one knew what to do, until someone suggested something unusual. There was a dog back at the rescue center, a golden Labrador named Kaya. She had lost her own litter just months before and hadn't been the same since. She barely ate. She barely moved. But when they brought her near the pups, just to see, something shifted. Her ears perked, her tail lifted, and before anyone could say a word, Kaya lay down in front of the cage and waited. No growling, no fear, just stillness. What happened next would stun everyone, because Kaya didn't just accept the pups. She made a decision that would change all their lives forever. They named her Nala, not after the lioness from a cartoon, but because she carried herself with the same quiet strength, the same motherly presence. Nala wasn't anyone's idea of a hero. She was an aging Labrador mix, rescued from a shelter after being surrendered by a family who moved away. Her hips ached in the mornings and her bark was more of a sigh than a sound. But when the 3 orphaned hyena pups were brought into the sanctuary, something ancient stirred in her. At first, the staff was cautious. Hyenas were unpredictable, even young ones. But the pups were weak, barely walking, their fur patchy, eyes wide with grief and confusion. They cried all night, refusing formula, refusing blankets. Nala watched from a distance, unmoving, until the smallest one, whimpering, wandered close to her crate and collapsed. She didn't growl, she didn't retreat. She simply stood, limped forward, and gently nudged the pup with her nose. Once, twice, then she lay down beside him, curling her aging frame around his tiny body. Within minutes, the other 2 joined, trembling as they pressed into her fur. From that night on, they were never apart. Nala became their mother in every sense. She licked their ears clean. She growled softly when they played too rough. She herded them away from danger. And perhaps most surprisingly, she let them try to nurse. Of course, there was no milk, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the ritual, the comfort, the illusion of safety. The staff, initially stunned, now referred to her not as the old dog, but Mama Nala. As weeks passed, the change was undeniable. The pups grew stronger. Their laughter, yes, that unmistakable hyena cackle, returned. They played in the sun, pounced on insects, and followed Nala wherever she went. And she moved differently now. Slower, yes, but with purpose. She was no longer waiting to be useful. She was needed. By month 3, the sanctuary made a difficult decision. The hyenas, though bonded to Nala, would eventually need to join others of their kind. A wildlife reserve had agreed to take them in. It was the right move, the professional move. But no one asked Nala how she felt. The day of the transfer, she paced from room to room, barking low and strange, her nails scraping the tile. The crates were loaded into the truck, one by one, each hyena pup now heavier, louder, more wild. But as the last one was carried out, he howled. Not in protest, but in fear. The sound echoed across the sanctuary, and Nala, who hadn't run in months, ran. She bolted from the back gate, tail raised, lungs burning, ignoring every shout behind her. She reached the truck just before it pulled away, planted herself in front of the wheels and refused to move. The staff stood frozen. Even the reserve officials were silent. The pups, hearing her, cried back, paws scraping at their crate doors. So they made a compromise. The reserve agreed to allow Nala to accompany the hyenas during their transition, just for a few weeks. It was unheard of. A domestic dog in a wild predator enclosure? But what happened next silenced every skeptic. At first, the staff at the Wildlife Reserve kept Nala and the pups in a separate enclosure. High fences, daily monitoring, emergency protocols in place. But it quickly became clear, those protocols weren't for the hyenas. They were for her. Because the moment the crates were opened and the pups stumbled out into the grass, they didn't run. They didn't scatter. They turned. And they ran straight to her. The oldest one, bigger now, nearly her size, collapsed at her feet and licked her chin. The second rested his head on her back. And the third, the smallest, burrowed underneath her, as he used to when his bones were still fragile. It was as if time folded in on itself. They weren't just wild animals adapting to a new life. They were children trying to hold on to the only mother they had ever known. And Nala didn't hesitate. She lay down in the middle of that field, surrounded by three creatures the world had taught her to fear. She curled her body around them, eyes closing not in exhaustion, but in peace. Days passed. The staff observed something extraordinary. The pups were thriving, faster than expected, more confident, more social. And the only common factor? Nala's presence. They played only when she watched. They ate only when she licked their faces. And at night, instead of pacing or howling, they curled up around her like a living heartbeat, warm, steady, familiar. Even the other hyenas, adults in nearby enclosures, watched with a strange curiosity. Some growled low in confusion. Others simply stared, but none dared approach too closely. It was as if an invisible boundary had formed around her, a circle of trust built not from species or instinct, but from something more powerful. Love given freely against every rule of nature. By the third week, something shifted. One morning, the gate was accidentally left slightly ajar. A young wild hyena from another enclosure slipped through. He was aggressive, territorial, a male who had fought others for dominance. He charged. Staff rushed to intervene. But before they reached the enclosure, the three adopted pups had already moved. They stepped between Nala and the attacker, not snarling, not biting, just standing, shoulder to shoulder, like silent sentinels. The aggressor stopped, sniffed, growled, but didn't attack. Instead, he circled once and retreated. The staff stood frozen. No commands were given. No instincts explained it. It wasn't dominance. It was protection, the kind only family offers. And Nala? She remained lying in the grass, watching them, not with fear, but with something deeper. Pride. Not the kind bred into pedigrees or show dogs, but the kind earned slowly, through heartbreak and healing. Nala, once discarded, once thought unfit even for adoption, had become the center of something wild and sacred. Not a caretaker, not a curiosity, a mother, a leader, a bridge between worlds. Every day that passed, the staff watched her with a mix of disbelief and awe. The hyenas were growing, taller, stronger, fiercer, but never aggressive toward her. They shared their food with her, brought her sticks and leaves as if offering gifts. And when one of them was injured during an accidental scuffle, it was her tongue that cleaned the wound and her body that kept him warm through the night. Visitors came expecting to see a miracle. What they found instead was something quieter, more intimate. A golden dog with soft eyes lying in the sun with three predators curled at her side, one resting his massive head on her belly, another chewing gently on her tail, the third sprawled over her back like a child refusing to grow up. Cameras clicked. Documentaries began. But no one, Not even the scientists could agree on how it had happened. Was it maternal instinct, imprinting, a rare fluke of animal behavior, or was it something else? Because when the staff tried, gently, cautiously, to separate them for medical reasons, chaos erupted. The hyenas screamed. Nala barked with a fury no one had ever seen. She paced, whined, scratched at the gates until her paws bled, and the pups refused to eat for 3 days until they were returned to her. Only then did silence return. Only then did they breathe again. But something had shifted. The staff realized this wasn't just unusual, it was unbreakable. Nala and the hyenas weren't just bonded. They were family in a way no enclosure or fence could contain. So they stopped trying to manage it. Instead, they built something new, a larger space, half natural habitat, half shelter. It had shaded trees, soft soil, and an open-air den where Nala and her adopted pups could roam freely. But even in that freedom, Nala never wandered far from them. If one of the hyenas strayed too close to a gate, she gently herd him back. If she sensed strangers nearby, she'd position herself between them and the trio, tail stiff, ears forward, every inch of her radiating the warning of a mother ready to defend her young. And the hyenas, they grew. They shed the awkward, trembling frame of infancy and took on the powerful, muscular shape of their kind. But never once did they turn on her. They never tested her authority, never snapped, never growled. Instead, they played. They groomed her. They slept beside her like cubs who never knew she wasn't born one of them. The local news picked up the story, then the national, then the world. People traveled from countries away to see what was being called the most unlikely family in the animal kingdom. But no photo, no documentary, no viral clip could capture what it felt like to stand at the edge of their enclosure and see it with your own eyes. A dog, once abandoned, now curled protectively around 3 carnivores once destined for death. And maybe what shocked people most was not the bond itself, but how effortless it looked, as if this impossible love was the most natural thing in the world. But nature, as always, had its own tests. One late afternoon, a distant growl echoed across the facility. A pair of rogue male hyenas, likely drawn by scent, had approached the perimeter fence. They were older, larger, and wild, untouched by human hands or compassion. As they stalked closer, the 3 young hyenas stiffened. Their instincts tugged at something ancient, primal. Nala sensed it too. She stood tall, her body low and tense, not in fear, but in protection. One of the intruders growled louder, pacing along the fence, daring the young ones to come closer. The staff watched nervously, unsure what would happen next. Would the trio be pulled toward their own kind? Would instinct overtake the bond they had shared with the dog who had raised them? For a moment, everything hung in silence. Then the youngest hyena, Mavi, did something that stunned everyone. He turned, not toward the fence, but toward Nala, and he leaned into her side. The other 2 followed, their heads tucked low, tails soft. And then Nala barked, once, sharp, final, a warning that shook even the rogue males. They paused and retreated. No one moved for a long time after. The staff, the hyenas, even Nala herself. It was as if the entire world had been holding its breath. And then Nala lay down, wrapping her body around her 3 children as the sun dipped below the trees. They had passed the test, not by blood, not by breed, but by choice. Because real family isn't who you're born to. It's who stays when the wild calls your name, and the wild did call. In the weeks that followed, wildlife officials faced pressure to relocate the hyenas to a sanctuary where they could socialize with their own kind. Experts argued that long-term integration into a natural habitat was vital. But when the team arrived with tranquilizers and transport crates, they were met with resistance no one expected. Not from the animals, but from the bond. The moment the staff approached with leashes and gloves, the 3 hyenas panicked, not from fear of humans, but from fear of separation. They pressed against Nala, whimpering, growling, even snapping at the crates. Nala didn't bark this time. She didn't growl either. She simply stood tall, unmoving, placing her body in front of the smallest one like a shield. her eyes locked with the handlers. There was no aggression, just a plea. Not yet, not like this. The lead veterinarian made a call that went against protocol. He gave them more time, and in that time, something shifted. Instead of trying to force a transition, the staff decided to study the bond. Cameras were set up, behaviorists took notes, and what they discovered surprised even the most seasoned experts. The hyenas didn't just tolerate Nala, they mimicked her. They mirrored her cues, followed her discipline, responded to her vocal tones more than they ever had to others of their kind. Even their body language began to adapt. Not entirely canine, but not entirely hyena either. Something new, something learned. The wild hadn't claimed them, not yet, not as long as they still needed the one who had loved them when no one else had. Weeks turned into months. The story of the dog who adopted 3 hyena pups spread across the country, then the world. Wildlife magazines picked it up. A documentary team requested access. School children sent hand-drawn pictures of Nala and her unlikely family. But to Nala, none of it mattered. She didn't understand the headlines or the applause. All she knew was that the pups still cried in their sleep, that they still came to her belly for warmth, that when thunder rolled in the distance, they huddled under her chest and stayed there until the sky cleared. And though they grew, taller, stronger, wilder, they always came back. One morning, a loud bang echoed through the compound. A tree had fallen during the night storm, breaking part of the outer fence. Staff rushed to check on the animals, fearing escape or injury. But when they reached the yard, they found the hyenas all standing still, inside the broken gate. They weren't trying to flee. They weren't curious. They were waiting for Nala, who was asleep under the porch. She stirred at the noise, saw the open path to the world beyond, then looked at her pups and lay back down. So did they, because where she stayed, they stayed. Even now, bigger than her, stronger, equipped with instincts she could never teach, they still saw her not as prey, not as pack, but as mother. And that instinct, the one no scientist could trace or explain, proved stronger than blood, than biology, than fear. They'd seen other hyenas during routine transports or vet checks, smelled the wild on the wind, but none of it pulled them the way Nala did. One day, a behavioral researcher watched in disbelief as one of the male pups, now nearly full-grown, chased off a younger hyena, trying to approach Nala's enclosure. His hackles rose, his teeth bared, and when the stranger didn't back away fast enough, he lunged. The message was clear. This isn't just a dog, this is our dog, and we protect her. The staff began to realize the depth of their bond when the pups refused to be separated. Attempts to begin gradual rewilding programs failed. They wouldn't eat unless she was near, wouldn't rest unless her scent was present. One even injured himself trying to leap a barrier when Nala was taken for a routine medical checkup. They had grown into predators feared by many, yet in the presence of that golden-furred dog, they transformed into overgrown babies, licking her face, whining for her attention, curling beside her as though they were still fragile bundles of fur in a police station reception room. She had become their anchor, and they, her legacy. Because even as the world around them changed, new faces, new routines, new scents, what remained unshakable was the thread that tied them together. Trust born in trauma, loyalty born in need. Nala hadn't nursed them, hadn't come from their world, hadn't even spoken their language. But she had done the one thing no one else did in their darkest hour. She stayed. She was there when the cage door opened, there when the fear was too big to name, there when the trembling didn't stop. And now, though months had passed and their teeth were sharper, their gait more confident, their instincts harder to predict, when night fell and the sanctuary quieted, they always sought the same place, curled beside the one creature who had made the unknown feel safe. Nala would often lift her head at the sound of approaching caretakers, as if reminding them silently, "They're still mine." And in return, the 3 hyenas would watch her every movement, ears alert, eyes soft, bodies relaxed only when she was near. It was a rhythm no one had expected, one that rewrote the rules of species, of survival, of belonging. Not because they forgot who they were, but because they remembered who had loved them when they were nothing. They weren't pets. She wasn't prey. They were something else entirely. A family that never should have existed, but did. And in the quiet corners of the sanctuary, where the wind rustled through the trees and the stars blinked through open sky, their presence whispered a truth that defied biology, that bonds formed in pain often run deeper than blood. Caretakers watched in awe as the hyena pups, once feral and frantic, followed Nala's every move with the obedience of soldiers and the affection of children. When she stood, they stood. When she barked, they paused. And when she slept, they curled around her like shadows clinging to warmth. Yet it wasn't just habit, it was healing. There was a night when one of the pups, Kiro, woke crying from a nightmare, yelping into the darkness as if reliving the metal cage, the smell of blood, the gunshots that stole his mother. Before the caretakers could react, Nala was already at his side, pressing her body close, licking his ears gently, until his cries melted into a whimper, and then into silence. The other two pups pressed in too, not to comfort him, but to be comforted, because Nala was the anchor, the soft place, the memory of a future they hadn't known they could still have. And in her presence, they were no longer orphans, not victims, not experiments, just loved. And that love transformed them. Within weeks, the three hyena pups, Cairo, Mavi, and Suma, had begun to mirror Nala's behaviors, not just in motion, but in emotion. They no longer flinched at human footsteps or cowered at sudden sounds. Instead, they approached cautiously but curiously, often checking back with Nala before inching closer. And every time one of them trembled or froze in uncertainty, Nala would nudge them forward, like a mother encouraging her children to trust the world again. The caretakers couldn't believe what they were seeing. These were hyenas, animals often misunderstood, feared, and in many regions despised. But under Nala's care, they behaved more like puppies, playful, bonded, and most of all, safe. There was a moment, caught on a sanctuary camera, where Suma was playfully biting Nala's tail while Kiro climbed over her back, and she didn't growl or flinch. She simply let them. And when Mavi yawned and rested his head on her belly, Nala curled around them all like a living blanket, her eyes slowly closing as if to say, "This is right. This is home." But the transformation wasn't one-sided. Nala changed too. The Labrador, who had once been found wandering the outskirts of a burned-down village, starved and silent, now walked with pride. Her tail, once tucked and timid, now wagged low and slow, a quiet signal of calm confidence. She didn't just tolerate the hyenas, she protected them. When a group of new volunteers arrived at the sanctuary and tried to get too close too fast, Nala stepped in front of the pups, stiffened her body, and let out a single warning bark. Not aggressive, just clear. These are mine, and everyone understood. It wasn't just that she had adopted them, it was that she had claimed them, defended them, taught them what no other being could, that their lives, despite what they'd endured, still had value, still held hope. Because sometimes the most broken become the bravest. And sometimes family doesn't look like what you expect, but feels exactly like what you need. Each morning at the sanctuary began the same. 3 small hyenas bounding out from under the wooden shade structure, their heads darting around until they spotted her. Nala. She never barked, never chased, never commanded. She simply stood still, tail swaying gently, until all 3 had pressed against her sides. Sometimes they would nip at her ears or tug at her legs, testing limits like all young ones do. And every time Nala responded with quiet patience, her eyes soft, her movements measured. If one lagged behind, she waited. If one wandered too far, she herded them back, not with force, but with presence. But the real turning point came when the youngest pup, Mavi, fell ill. It started as a limp, subtle, almost playful. But by nightfall, he refused food and curled into a tight, shivering ball. The volunteers rushed to treat him, antibiotics, fluids, warmth. But Nala didn't leave his side once. For hours, she lay curled around him, her body shielding him from the cold, her nose occasionally nuzzling his fur, as if whispering something only mother hearts could understand. When Mavi whimpered in pain, Nala licked his ears. When he thrashed in fever dreams, she gently placed a paw over his chest, holding him still, not with control, but comfort. And as the sun rose the next morning, so did Mavi. He wobbled to his feet, weak but alive. And the first thing he did wasn't eat or drink. It was to stumble over to Nala and lay his head on her paws. From that day on, the staff no longer referred to them as rescued hyenas and the dog who helped. They simply called them the Four. Not because it was cute, but because it was true. Because Nala had given them something no medicine, no cage, no human could provide. Something unteachable, a reason to stay. And from that point forward, they did. Through every storm that pounded the metal rooftops of the sanctuary, through every heat wave that cracked the earth beneath their feet, through every moment of chaos when other animals cried out in fear, Nala and her 3 unlikely children remained together. When danger came close, whether it was the sudden roar of a nearby predator or a careless visitor dropping something loud, they didn't run to the corners of their enclosure. They ran to her, not because she was the strongest, not because she was the fastest, but because in her stillness, they found safety. The staff began noticing changes too. The hyenas, once skittish and unpredictable, became calmer, more trusting. They no longer lashed out when approached, no longer recoiled when touched. And Nala, she grew into something sacred, not just a caretaker, not just a protector, but a guide. One morning, a researcher visiting the sanctuary sat silently at the edge of the pen, watching. He was there to study animal behavior. He came with a clipboard, a camera, and a dozen assumptions. But all those assumptions melted the moment he saw what unfolded before him. 3 young hyenas laying side by side, their heads resting on Nala's body, while she groomed each one gently, like she was rewriting something that had been broken long before they arrived. The man didn't take notes. He simply wept. And he wasn't the only one, because over time, word spread, not just about the hyenas who survived, but about the dog who gave them back their childhood, about the one who mothered the motherless, about Nala, the unlikely matriarch. They grew up, and as they did, something remarkable happened. They didn't grow wild, they grew loyal, not to humans, not to walls, but to her. When the day came that one of the hyenas was to be transferred to another sanctuary for genetic diversity, it refused to leave Nala's side. It howled, not the fierce snarl hyenas are known for, but a mournful cry that echoed through the valley like a child being torn from its mother. The transfer was postponed, then canceled, because the staff realized something. This wasn't a temporary bond. It was permanent. Years passed. The hyenas became fully grown, larger and stronger than Nala, but never once did they forget who saved them. They guarded her, walked beside her, slept curled around her in the cold. Visitors gasped seeing such a sight. A gentle Labrador curled against 3 predators, all breathing in rhythm, like a single heartbeat shared by 4 mismatched souls. And when Nala grew old, when her legs slowed and her muzzle grayed, the hyenas took care of her, brought her food, licked her face clean, surrounded her with the same fierce tenderness she had once offered them. When she finally passed, the sanctuary held a memorial, not just for a dog, but for a legend. The hyenas stood silently over her resting place for 3 days. No snarls, no growls, just presence. Because in a world that said, this shouldn't be possible, she made it possible. She was a dog, they were hyenas, but they called her mother. If this story moved you, share it. Because sometimes the most powerful families are the ones we choose.